A missed interview, a fiery crash, and a second chance at life. This is how a single dad's world turned upside down. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartwarming stories. The morning had started with the kind of quiet hope Ethan Cole rarely allowed himself. The streets of Portland were still waking up, bathed in a pale gold light as he steered his beat-up sedan toward Maddie's elementary school. She sat in the passenger seat, swinging her legs, her unicorn backpack hugged tightly against her chest. Ethan wore the new shirt he had saved for weeks to buy, its stiff collar pressing against his neck. Today was supposed to be different. After dropping Maddie off, he would drive across town for an interview that might finally lift them out of the cycle of overdue rent notices and endless night shifts. He was already rehearsing answers in his head when the scream of tires shattered the calm. Out of nowhere, a sleek black car spun across the freeway, slammed into the concrete barrier, and crumpled like a soda can. In a heartbeat, flames licked at the hood, black smoke curling into the sky. Ethan's hands tightened on the wheel. He pulled over, his heart hammering. Other drivers slowed, phones raised to capture the wreck, but no one moved closer. Maddie's voice broke through the chaos, trembling but clear. "Dad, someone's inside." Ethan's eyes locked on the shattered driver's side window. Through the glass he saw her, a woman in a tailored suit, her face pale, a streak of blood running down her temple. She looked frozen, her blue eyes staring past the flames as if she had already given up. "Stay here, Maddie," Ethan said, his voice steady even as fear rushed through him. He pulled his flannel sleeves down over his hands and ran. The heat hit him first, fierce and biting. He crouched by the twisted door, shards of glass cutting into his arms as he reached inside. "Look at me," he urged, gripping her shoulders. "Your story isn't over. Fight. You have to fight." For a moment, she didn't respond. Then her lips parted, a faint whisper slipping out. "Please, just go." "Not without you," he growled, pulling at the jammed door with every ounce of strength. It groaned but didn't budge. Smoke thickened, clawing at his lungs. He reached back through the broken window, fumbling with the seatbelt until the buckle clicked free. "Push with your feet when I pull," he commanded. She blinked, dazed, but nodded. 1, 2, 3. He wrapped his arms around her and heaved, ignoring the glass slicing into his forearm. She pushed weakly, then stronger, and suddenly she was free. They tumbled backward onto the asphalt just as a wave of fire engulfed the car in a deafening roar. Ethan dragged her farther from the flames, his chest heaving. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The woman trembled in his arms, her gaze locked on the burning wreck she had barely escaped. She looked at him with disbelief, as if trying to memorize his face. "You saved me." He shook his head, breathless. Anyone would have. But he knew that wasn't true. Around them, traffic had stopped. Dozens of people watched from a safe distance, phones still raised, while his daughter stood on the curb, eyes wide with pride and fear. Ethan Cole had just saved a stranger's life. But with the clock ticking toward 9, he knew the future he had dreamed of that morning might already be slipping away. By the time the fire trucks drowned out the last crackle of the burning car, Ethan was already guiding Maddie back to their old sedan, his shirt torn, the sleeves soaked with blood, and the sharp sting in his arm throbbing with every heartbeat. But he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. The interview was gone. The clock had decided that for him. All that was left was Maddie's small hand in his, the weight of her silence, and the sound of sirens fading into the distance behind them. That night, their apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the scratch of Maddie's colored pencils across a page. Ethan sat at the kitchen table under the weak glow of a single bulb, a needle and thread trembling between his fingers. He didn't have the money for a doctor. A sewing kit from the dollar store and a half-empty bottle of rubbing alcohol were all he could manage. Every pull of the thread sent fire racing up his arm, but he pressed his lips together and kept going. Maddie glanced up, her brow furrowed. "Does it hurt, Dad?" "Only when I think about it," he whispered, tying off the last stitch with a grimace. She didn't answer, just pushed a drawing across the table, a crayon picture of him flying through the air like a superhero, pulling a stick-figure woman from a red scribble of fire. A yellow sun shone brightly in the corner. "For your new office," she said, her voice matter-of-fact, as if it were already true. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He didn't tell her the HR woman had already said the position was filled. He didn't say that heroism didn't fit on a resume. He just smiled and taped the drawing to the refrigerator, right next to the overdue bill from the power company. Across the city, in a glass tower that pierced the Portland skyline, Lauren Bennett couldn't sleep. The cut on her temple had been stitched neatly by paramedics, but no one had found a way to quiet the words that echoed in her mind. Your story isn't over. Fight. She replayed them again and again, the memory of soot on his face, the raw urgency in his eyes, the arms that had dragged her back from the fire. A stranger had told her to live, and for the first time in years, she had listened. On the massive screen in her penthouse office, she watched the shaky cell phone footage that the world had already begun calling the freeway miracle. Dozens of angles uploaded within minutes replayed endlessly, the black car spinning, the explosion of flame, and him, the man in the flannel shirt ripping open the world to pull her free. Comment sections were filled with praise. Freeway hero, guardian angel, Portland's bravest. But to Lauren, the titles didn't matter. What mattered were his eyes. She had built her empire on calculation, on the belief that everything had a price. Yet in those few moments, he hadn't bargained or hesitated. He had risked everything without asking for anything in return. She leaned back in her chair, the city lights stretching below her like a sea of stars. She had survived the wreck, but something deeper had shifted. For years, she had worn armor so heavy she no longer noticed it. In the fire, that armor had cracked, and the ghost of a man she couldn't name haunted the space between every breath. Somewhere in the sprawl of Portland, he was just living his life. Unseen, uncelebrated, patching himself up with dollar store thread. But Lauren Bennett knew she wouldn't rest until she found him. And Ethan, sitting in his kitchen with a superhero drawing on his fridge, had no idea his life had already been set on a collision course with hers. Lauren Bennett was not the kind of woman who allowed loose ends. For decades, she had built her empire on precision. Numbers, contracts, algorithms. Every question had an answer, every problem a solution. Yet the man who had pulled her from the fire remained a blank page, and it gnawed at her like a splinter she couldn't reach. She had her team run facial recognition on every frame of the shaky videos. Nothing, no record, no match. It was as if her savior had vanished into thin air. But Lauren was relentless. She watched the footage again, frame by frame, until her sharp eyes caught something everyone else had missed. On the pocket of his torn flannel shirt, nearly hidden beneath the soot, was a faded patch, a logo, small, worn, but familiar. She froze, leaning closer to the screen. It was the emblem of a staffing agency, one her company often used for night shifts and maintenance crews. Her heart quickened. With a single phone call, she had the agency's roster pulled. Pages of names scrolled across the monitor, most of them strangers. And then she saw it. Ethan Cole, janitorial services, night shift, assigned to Bennett Logistics. Lauren sat back in her chair, stunned. The man who had saved her life, the figure who had haunted her sleepless nights, was not a firefighter, not a soldier, not some trained rescuer. He was a janitor in her own company, an invisible presence who swept her floors and emptied her trash cans while she signed billion-dollar deals. She pressed her fingertips to her temple, feeling the faint throb of the scar beneath the bandage. A janitor, she whispered the word aloud, tasting its dissonance. How could someone the world overlooked so easily have been the one to drag her back into it? For the first time in years, she felt small, almost humbled. Her empire of glass and steel suddenly seemed fragile compared to the quiet strength of a man who stitched his own wounds and told strangers to keep fighting. She thought of his voice, low and commanding in the chaos. Your story isn't over. Lauren rose from her chair and crossed the office, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She stopped at the window, gazing down at the city that glittered beneath her. Somewhere in the maze of warehouses and night shift corridors she rarely acknowledged, Ethan Cole pushed a broom, anonymous and unseen. And yet to her, he was the only face she could not forget. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. This discovery was more than unexpected. It was unsettling for a woman who believed every person had a measurable value. Ethan Cole was an equation that didn't add up, He had risked everything and asked for nothing. He had saved her life, then disappeared into the shadows of her own company, as if it meant nothing at all. But Lauren Bennett knew herself too well. She couldn't let it end here. Not with a name on a file, not when her life had been pulled from the flames by hands that now scrubbed her hallways. She would find him. She would look him in the eye, not as a CEO facing an employee, but as a woman staring at the man who had rewritten the story of her life in the span of a single burning moment. Saturday morning sunlight spilled across the cracked sidewalks of a Portland neighborhood where the houses leaned tiredly against each other, paint peeling, yards patched with weeds. Ethan crouched on the front steps of his small duplex, guiding Maddie's little hands as she worked the greasy chain back onto her bicycle. Her laughter was bright, unburdened, filling the quiet street with a sound that made the old place feel almost alive again. Then the low thrum of blades cut through the air. At first, Ethan thought it was a news chopper, but the sound grew louder, heavier, until the vibration pressed into his chest. Maddie looked up, her eyes wide. Neighbors spilled from their porches, shielding their faces as the black helicopter descended toward the park at the end of the block. On its sleek side was the sharp emblem of Bennett Logistics. Dust and leaves whipped through the street as the rotors slowed, doors slammed open, and then she stepped out. Lauren Bennett, no longer in the bloodstained suit from the crash, but in a silk blouse and dark tailored trousers, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. The cut on her temple was hidden beneath a discreet bandage. For a moment, she seemed carved from another world, one of glass towers and boardrooms, but her piercing blue eyes swept past the gathering crowd until they found Ethan. She walked toward him with calm authority, the neighbors parting as though some invisible force cleared her path. Maddie clung to Ethan's leg, whispering, "Dad, it's the lady from the fire." Ethan stood, his throat tightening as Lauren stopped just a few feet away. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice crisp, certain, "you saved my life." She extended her hand, and in it was a thick cream-colored envelope. "This belongs to you, a token of my gratitude, enough that you and your daughter will never have to worry again." The crowd around them hushed. Ethan looked at the envelope, heavy with promise, then back at her face. He could see the confidence in her eyes, the belief that money solved everything, that value could be written in numbers. His jaw tightened. He shook his head slowly. "I can't accept that, ma'am," he said quietly. Lauren blinked, the composure on her face cracking for the briefest moment. "I don't think you understand," she began, her tone sharper now. "This is life-changing. You've earned—" "I didn't do it for money," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. He held her gaze, steady and unflinching. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. I'm glad you're alive. That's all the reward I need." A ripple moved through the crowd, neighbors murmuring, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Lauren's hand remained suspended, the envelope untouched. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she was speechless. People didn't refuse Lauren Bennett. No one said no to millions. Yet here was a man in worn jeans and a frayed flannel shirt, standing in front of his daughter and turning her entire philosophy upside down. She searched his face, trying to understand, but there was no calculation there, no hidden angle, just honesty, raw and unpolished. Maddie peeked out from behind his leg, her eyes shining with simple pride. Lauren lowered her hand slowly, the envelope still clutched tightly between her fingers. For a moment, she looked less like a CEO and more like a woman whose certainty had been quietly dismantled. Without another word, her phone vibrated sharply in her pocket, dragging her back into her world of deals and deadlines. She turned, striding toward the waiting helicopter, her hair whipping in the rotor wash as the blades roared and the black machine lifted off. Ethan held Maddie close, dust swirling around them. The neighbors remained silent, stunned by what they had witnessed. Lauren Bennett had arrived with power and money, but left with neither accepted. And Ethan Cole, just a janitor, just a father, stood unchanged, his dignity unbought, his values intact. For Lauren, the certainty she carried like armor had cracked once again. And for the first time, she wasn't sure what her money was truly worth. The roar of the helicopter had barely faded from Ethan's street when life pulled him back into its usual rhythm. By Monday night, he was back in the cavernous warehouse of Bennett Logistics, pushing his mop bucket under the harsh industrial lights. The place smelled of oil and ozone, alive with the hum of machines that cost more than he could ever imagine earning. He had grown used to being invisible here, the man who swept the floors while engineers argued over laptops and prototypes. In the center of the vast floor stood the Apex machine, the pride of Bennett Logistics. It was sleek, towering, a million moving parts meant to redefine the future of shipping. But Ethan's eyes didn't see what the engineers saw. He didn't look at graphs or code. He looked at the way the pivot joint shivered ever so slightly when the sorting arm swung down, the way a faint rattle echoed like a loose bolt with every movement. To most people, it was nothing. But to Ethan, it was a ticking clock, a flaw that would grow with every test until something snapped. He paused, leaning on his mop, watching as two engineers tapped furiously at their screens, trying to hunt down a software bug. They never once looked at the steel, never once touched the machine. When their shift ended, they packed up, leaving Apex to stand in the dark like a sleeping giant. Ethan wheeled his cart closer. He crouched by the joint, running his calloused fingers along the housing. There it was, the vibration, subtle but fatal. He glanced around the empty warehouse, then reached into his cart. From beneath the rags and spare tools, he pulled out a scrap of metal plating and a coil of heavy wire he'd salvaged weeks ago. Not much, but sometimes it didn't take much. Working quickly, his hands moved with the steady confidence of a man who had fixed everything from leaky pipes to broken bicycles. He fashioned the plate into a brace, pressed it against the joint, and wound the wire tightly, knotting it with a craftsman's care. When he finished, he tested the arm by hand, listening for the rattle. Silence. The machine moved smoothly now, stable. He gave a small nod, wiped his hands on his jeans, and went back to his mop as if nothing had happened. The next morning, Lauren Bennett stood at the head of a tense meeting. Investors were due for a demonstration, and Apex had been on the verge of failure. Mark Stevens, her vice president of technical operations, insisted the issue was minor, just a software glitch. "My team has it under control," he assured, his voice smooth, his smile too practiced. But when the machine came to life, something had changed. The Apex moved flawlessly, arms steady, containers sorted with perfect precision. Relief rippled through the room. Mark basked in the glow, claiming credit with ease. "As I said, just a minor patch." Lauren's eyes narrowed. She knew the cadence of deception, the difference between genuine confidence and a man covering his tracks. Later that evening in her office, she demanded the security feeds from the warehouse. Hours of footage flickered across the screen until the moment appeared. The engineers leaving, the warehouse going quiet, and then Ethan Cole. There he was, in his gray janitor's uniform, standing before the Apex. She watched him touch the joint, close his eyes as if listening to the machine's heartbeat, then pull the scrap and wire from his cart. His movements were calm, efficient, almost reverent. When the brace was done, he gave that small nod, the nod of someone who knew he had fixed something no one else even understood. Lauren leaned back in her chair, her breath catching. The man she had misjudged, the man she had tried to buy off, had just saved her company, and the executive she trusted most had lied to her face. The truth was undeniable. The next morning, when Mark Stevens swaggered into her office with his usual charm, he found Lauren waiting with the footage paused behind her on a massive screen. His face drained of color. Lauren's voice was cool, sharp as glass. "You didn't save Apex. He did, and you lied about it." Mark stammered, searching for excuses, but Lauren cut him off with two words that echoed like a verdict. "You're done." Security escorted him out, while Lauren stared once more at the frozen image of Ethan on the screen. A janitor, unseen by everyone but her, had saved more than just her life. He had saved the future of Bennett Logistics, and she knew this was only the beginning. Lauren Bennett had built her empire on recognizing value where others overlooked it, and now she couldn't ignore what she had seen. The security footage of Ethan Cole bracing the Apex machine played again in her mind. Every movement of his hands precise and unhurried, every decision rooted in a quiet confidence no resume could capture. He hadn't just patched a flaw. He had seen the truth of the machine when others, with all their degrees and credentials, had missed it entirely. The following week, Lauren made a decision that startled her own executive board. She walked into the night shift break room where Ethan sat, his mop bucket parked by the door, shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Maddie's crayon drawing peeked from the pocket of his worn flannel, a small burst of color against the gray of his life. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of vending machines. He looked up, startled to see her standing there in a tailored suit, eyes sharp and unyielding. "I've seen what you can do. You don't belong on this shift. You belong in my research and development division." Ethan froze, unsure he had heard her right. "Ma'am, I don't have a degree. I never even finished college." His words carried the weight of old failures, the kind that clung no matter how hard a man tried to shake them. Lauren stepped closer, her tone softening, but never wavering. "I have plenty of people with degrees. What I don't have is someone who sees what they can't. You fixed the apex when no one else could. That's not janitorial work, that's invention." The offer hung in the air, almost too heavy to grasp. Ethan felt the instinct to step back, to retreat into the safe anonymity of being invisible. But the memory of Maddie's drawing on the fridge, him with a cape saving lives, pressed against his heart. He nodded slowly. "I'll try." On Monday morning, Ethan walked into the R&D lab. Glass walls gleamed, whiteboards were scrawled with equations, and engineers in crisp shirts clustered around prototypes. His own clothes felt out of place, his calloused hands too rough for this world of precision. Whispers followed him. "That's the janitor, the guy from the video." Lauren broke the silence with authority. "This is Ethan Cole, our newest innovation specialist," she announced. "He has a perspective we've been missing. I expect you to treat him as you would any other member of this team." Her gaze left no room for doubt. The first test came almost immediately. On a workbench sat the Sparrow, a sleek delivery drone that had plagued the department for months. It flew beautifully, but after 20 minutes, it overheated and crashed. Engineers had thrown every software patch at the problem, redesigned cooling vents, recalibrated sensors. Nothing worked. Ethan stood back, listening as they debated processor bottlenecks and thermal imaging data, their language a maze he could barely follow. The numbers blurred, but the machine itself called to him. He circled the drone, eyes tracing its lines, his fingertips brushing its carbon shell. Then he leaned closer, peering into the nest of wires crammed near the primary motor. It was simple, almost laughably so. The wires were bound too tightly with a zip tie, pressed against the heat of the motor. That trapped warmth traveled straight into the thermal sensor, fooling the system into believing the processor was overheating. "The problem isn't in the code," Ethan said quietly, but the words cut through the noise. Every head turned. He pointed. "It's the wiring. You reroute this bundle, give it space to breathe, and your overheating disappears." Silence filled the room. One of the senior engineers frowned, then leaned over to check. Within minutes, the truth was undeniable. The Sparrow flew again, this time steady, its flight stretching far past the 20-minute mark. Lauren's lips curved into the faintest smile. Ethan Cole, once the man who swept her hallways, had just solved what an entire department couldn't. Whispers of skepticism turned into murmurs of respect. For the first time, the title inventor didn't feel impossible. Ethan stood at the edge of the lab, still in his flannel, still with doubt tugging at his chest. But when he glanced through the glass wall, he saw Lauren watching him. Not as a janitor, not even as a charity case, but as a man who had proven himself. And for the first time in years, he let himself believe that maybe Maddie's drawing hadn't been a child's fantasy. Maybe, just maybe, it was a glimpse of who he was meant to become. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Ethan Cole had ever known. In the R&D lab, he no longer felt like an intruder in a borrowed space. The engineers who once looked at him with suspicion now leaned over his sketches, listening carefully as he explained his ideas in plain, unpolished words. Lauren was always nearby, sometimes in her glass office, sometimes at his workbench, her sharp blue eyes softening whenever she caught him guiding a young engineer through a design. It was strange, almost surreal, how naturally their worlds began to overlap. Outside the lab, life shifted too. Lauren started joining Ethan and Maddie for small moments that somehow mattered more than any boardroom victory. Sometimes she would stop by their modest apartment after work, sitting at the wobbly kitchen table as Ethan cooked pasta and Maddie chattered about her day. Other nights, she invited them to her penthouse, a place of cold marble and silence that Maddie quickly filled with drawings and laughter. Crayon suns and stick figures began to dot the edges of Lauren's pristine refrigerator, and to everyone's surprise, especially her own, she didn't mind at all. Maddie, in her innocent way, gave Lauren a name that caught both adults off guard. One evening, after Lauren had listened patiently to a long story about a scraped knee at recess, Maddie leaned her head against her father's arm and whispered, "Dad, I think she's like a fixer, but not for machines. She fixes the sad parts." She turned her wide eyes toward Lauren. "You're kind of like a sadness repair lady." Ethan chuckled, embarrassed, but Lauren felt something inside her crack open at the child's words. No one had ever described her that way. In her world, she was a strategist, a commander, a woman made of ice and steel. Yet here was a little girl telling her she was something warmer, something gentler. Lauren smiled, a real smile, the kind that didn't feel rehearsed. "I'll take that title," she said softly. "Sadness repair lady." Bit by bit, the armor Lauren had carried for years began to fall away. At first, it startled her. She had built her success on control, on never showing weakness, but in the quiet company of Ethan and Maddie, she found herself laughing more easily, listening more intently, letting silence stretch comfortably without the need to fill it with power. She began to remember what it was like to belong to something other than a corporation. For Ethan, the change was just as profound. He had spent years believing his role in life was to hold the world together with duct tape and grit, never asking for more. But when he saw Lauren cross her legs on his faded couch, a cup of instant coffee cradled in her hands, listening to Maddie describe her science project with the same attention she gave her board meetings, he realized he wasn't carrying everything alone anymore. Someone else was choosing to step into the mess with him. Maddie, of course, never saw the invisible walls between their lives. She saw only two adults who made her feel safe, one who tucked her in every night and another who showed up with a smile that could light up even the darkest corners of their small apartment. To her, it wasn't complicated. It was just family, the kind that fixed broken things, whether they were machines or hearts. And so, as the city outside spun in its relentless rhythm of profit and ambition, something quieter, more fragile, began to grow in the spaces between them. A connection that no paycheck could buy, no contract could enforce. The CEO, the janitor turned inventor, and the little girl who believed in both of them were, without even realizing it, becoming something they all thought they had lost long ago, a family. For a while, life settled into a rhythm that felt almost too good to be true. Ethan spent his nights sketching designs in the worn notebook Maddie had given him, filling its pages with the kind of ideas he once thought he would never share with anyone. Lauren would sometimes sit across the table, studying his careful lines as though each one held a secret, her sharp executive mind learning to slow down long enough to see the beauty of things built by hand. Maddie, curled on the couch with her crayons, would glance up and smile at them both, as if she knew something they hadn't yet dared to admit. But peace has a way of drawing shadows. It was late one evening when Ethan returned home to find the door to their small apartment ajar. His pulse spiked instantly. He stepped inside, scanning the room with the instinct of a man who had learned to live cautiously. Nothing seemed missing. The old television, the jar of emergency cash, even Maddie's toys scattered across the floor. For a moment, he thought he was imagining it. Then he saw the empty space on the kitchen table. His notebook was gone. Ethan's stomach dropped. That notebook wasn't just sketches. It was years of his mind poured out in graphite and ink, designs for engines, diagrams for drones, ideas scribbled in the quiet hours after Maddie fell asleep. Losing it felt like someone had stolen part of his soul. He turned slowly, and that's when he saw it. Lying neatly in the center of the table was a single black feather. It didn't belong there. It didn't belong anywhere in his world of grease and pencil shavings, yet its presence was deliberate, chilling. He picked it up, the slick surface cold between his fingers, and a name surfaced in his mind, the one Lauren had spoken only once, her voice taut with old grief and anger. Victor Hale. Later that night, Ethan drove through the quiet streets of Portland until the glass tower of Bennett Logistics loomed above him. He bypassed the receptionist and rode the private elevator to Lauren's penthouse. She opened the door to find him standing there, his face pale, the black feather clenched in his fist. "He knows," Ethan said simply. his voice low and rough. He stepped inside and dropped the feather onto her immaculate marble counter. Who is he, and why does he want me? Lauren's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the feather. Her eyes, usually hard as steel, softened into something he hadn't seen before: fear. She told him everything then, about Daniel Bennett, her late husband, about the brilliance that had once fueled their company, and about Victor Hale, Daniel's partner-turned-betrayer. How Hale had stolen Daniel's greatest invention, the Echo engine, and built his own empire on it, while Daniel's health failed and his heart finally gave out. Her voice broke when she admitted she had been fighting Hale ever since, through courts, through headlines, but he always stayed one step ahead. Now he had heard of Ethan, his work, his talent, the way he could see what others missed. Hale would see him not just as competition, but as proof of everything Lauren had built without him. To a man like Hale, that wasn't just inconvenient, it was intolerable. Ethan stared at her, the pieces clicking together. The break-in, the missing notebook, the feather. He realized with a cold certainty that he wasn't just fixing machines anymore. He was standing in the middle of someone else's unfinished war. Lauren's voice dropped to a whisper. He thinks you're the new Daniel. Ethan's jaw tightened. He thought of Maddie, safe for now in her room, drawing worlds where villains never won. He thought of the woman standing before him, her armor cracking once again under the weight of a past that refused to die. He closed his hand around the feather until it bent. No, he said, his voice steady, his eyes fierce. He doesn't get to erase me. He doesn't get to erase us. The feather slipped from his grip, falling silently to the floor. In that moment, Ethan knew the shadows had arrived, and this time, there would be no running from them. The black feather changed everything. From that night on, Ethan and Lauren lived with the quiet certainty that Victor Hale was watching. It wasn't just about stolen sketches or whispered threats. It was about power, about control, and about a man who had already destroyed once and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. They met in Lauren's office late into the night, the city spread out below like a map of possibilities and dangers. Ethan paced the length of the glass wall, his hands clenched, while Lauren sat at her desk, her eyes locked on him. He won't come at us in court, Ethan said. He won't challenge us in the open. He'll try to erase the work before the world ever sees it. He paused, then turned to her. So we give him something to destroy. It was the kind of strategy Lauren would never have considered before, but now it made a terrible kind of sense. They would announce a grand unveiling of their newest project, the GN1 navigation system. They would make it loud, impossible to ignore, sending invitations to the press, to industry leaders, and most importantly, to Victor himself. They would build a stage so tempting that he couldn't resist trying to tear it down. For 2 weeks, Bennett Logistics buzzed with preparation. Billboards appeared across Portland, promising the future of navigation. Reporters lined up interviews. Investors circled eagerly. And in the background, Ethan worked on something else entirely. Not the GN1 system, but a fleet of modified Sparrow drones, each rigged with independent backup power and low-light cameras, silent guardians for the trap they were about to spring. The night of the unveiling, the conference hall pulsed with energy. Spotlights swept the stage, the air thick with anticipation. Lauren stepped out, her presence commanding, her voice steady as she welcomed the crowd. For decades, navigation has relied on signals that falter. Tonight, we present something that doesn't look outward for guidance. It looks within. The audience leaned forward, waiting, but just as the main drone was about to rise from its platform, the lights flickered violently and then died, plunging the hall into darkness. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Somewhere in the shadows, Victor Hale smiled. This was his moment. But the darkness lasted only a breath. A dozen red lights snapped on overhead, piercing the black. Ethan's Sparrow drones hummed to life, their cameras feeding to the giant screen behind the stage. And there, frozen in the stark clarity of night vision, was the saboteur, a man in the rafters, wire cutters poised on the master cable. The crowd erupted, half in shock, half in awe. Lauren's voice rang out, calm and cold. It seems we have a technical difficulty, or perhaps evidence of one. Security swarmed the rafters, dragging the man down as the screen shifted again, this time not to the GN1 system, but to something far older, schematics, documents, proof. Lauren's voice broke only slightly as she spoke. This is Daniel Bennett, the true architect of the modern drone engine. His work was stolen by Victor Hale. Tonight, we return his legacy to him. Side by side on the screen, Daniel's original blueprints appeared, dated and signed. Then Victor's engine designs, identical down to the smallest detail. And finally, the file pulled from Hale's own servers, the creation date betraying his theft years before Daniel's death. The room was silent for a beat, the weight of truth pressing down on every heart. Then came the murmurs, the outrage, the cameras flashing like lightning as reporters pushed forward. Victor Hale, seated in the front row, looked suddenly small, his face a mask of disbelief as officers closed in. His empire had been built on a lie, and in a single evening, it crumbled. On stage, Lauren lifted her gaze, meeting Ethan's eyes where he stood in the wings. Together, without speaking, they understood. This wasn't just a victory for Bennett Logistics. It was justice for Daniel. It was proof that some truths, no matter how deeply buried, cannot be erased. And in the glow of a hall that had seen a man fall and a legacy restored, Ethan Cole realized he was no longer just fighting for survival. He was fighting for a future worth building. Months later, the storm had passed. The scandal that swallowed Victor Hale left him buried under indictments and headlines, his empire collapsing like a hollow structure, eaten away from the inside. For Lauren, the fight had ended not with fire, but with vindication. And for Ethan, it had given him something he never dared imagine. A place not just in her company, but in her life. On the 45th floor of Bennett Logistics, a new plaque gleamed outside the glass doors of the research division, Bennett and Cole Innovation Center. Ethan stood before it one quiet morning, coffee in hand, the hum of 3D printers and bright chatter of engineers drifting through the air behind him. His name looked strange there, etched in steel beside Lauren's, as if it belonged in the same sentence. He reached out, brushing his fingers lightly over the letters, still half convinced it would all vanish if he blinked. Inside the lab, he no longer carried a mop. He carried notebooks filled with sketches, diagrams, and bold ideas that now had a team eager to bring them to life. The same engineers who once whispered about the janitor now leaned over his shoulder, asking for his thoughts, waiting for his nod of approval. He hadn't stopped being who he was. He still spoke in plain words, still trusted his hands more than graphs, but somehow that had become his greatest strength. Lauren moved through the lab with her usual poise, but those closest to her noticed the change. Her voice was still sharp when it needed to be, her decisions as swift as ever, but the icy distance was gone. She laughed more now, sometimes at Maddie's doodles pinned proudly on the whiteboards, sometimes at the quiet jokes Ethan let slip when he thought no one was listening. She had found her rhythm, not only as a leader, but as a woman rediscovering what it meant to belong. At home, their lives began to weave together in ways none of them expected. Lauren's penthouse was no longer silent. Maddie filled it with songs, with drawings, with the smell of pancakes on weekends when Ethan insisted on cooking. Their small apartment, once dim and cluttered, now welcomed Lauren as naturally as if she had always been there. She learned to sit at the wobbly kitchen table without complaint, listening as Maddie explained her latest school project, watching Ethan's eyes soften with pride. One evening, as the sun set over Portland, the three of them stood at the wide window of the Innovation Center, the city lights beginning to flicker on like scattered stars. Maddie pressed her nose against the glass, pointing out landmarks below, while Lauren stood close beside Ethan. "Do you ever think about that day on the freeway?" she asked softly. Ethan looked at her, the memory flashing in his mind, the fire, the heat, the impossible choice. "Every day," he admitted. "It feels like everything started there." Lauren nodded, her gaze turning back to the city. It did. Justice for Daniel, a future for this company, and maybe something more than either of us expected. Her hand brushed against his, tentative but certain, and he laced his fingers with hers. Behind them, Maddie turned, her grin wide, unburdened by the weight of the moment. "I knew it," she said simply. "I knew we were supposed to be a family." Ethan bent down, pulling her into his arms, his voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, kiddo, you were right." He looked at Lauren, then, her smile soft, her eyes carrying the light of someone who had finally found a place to rest. From the flames of a wrecked car on the side of a Portland freeway to the quiet hum of a lab carrying both their names, They had traveled farther than either thought possible. They had fought for justice, for love, and for the kind of home you don't inherit, but choose to build. And as the city lights bloomed beneath them, Ethan, Lauren, and Maddie stood together, not as three separate lives colliding by chance, but as a new family, ready to write whatever came next, side by side. In the riveting tale of Ethan Cole, a single dad and janitor whose selfless act of pulling CEO Lauren Bennett from a burning car sparks an unexpected journey, we uncover a profound life lesson. True worth lies not in titles or wealth, but in the quiet courage to act with integrity and see value where others see none. Ethan, burdened by overdue bills and endless night shifts, risks everything to save a stranger, only to reject her offer of millions, proving that heroism isn't transactional. His unnoticed brilliance in fixing a critical machine at Bennett Logistics, coupled with Lauren's recognition of his unpolished genius, transforms him from an invisible janitor to an innovation specialist, challenging her belief that everything has a price. Their shared fight against Victor Hale's sabotage, driven by Maddie's innocent faith, weaves their lives into a family born from resilience and mutual respect. This story stirs the soul, evoking tears for the overlooked heroes among us, urging us to act with kindness and recognize potential in the humblest places, for such moments can spark justice, love, and belonging that no money can buy. It reminds us that life's greatest rewards come from choosing what's right over what's easy, building bonds that endure beyond any empire. If this narrative touched your heart, resonating with your own moments of unseen courage or unexpected connections that redefined your path, share your stories in the comments below. What act of kindness changed your life? And don't forget to like and subscribe for more soul-stirring tales of sacrifice, redemption, and family. Your support keeps this community alive, one inspiring story at a time.